this evening we are going to talk about abstraction in arts, and it's of a great fortune that we have two very brilliant original minds. The younger one is Aishwarya. She is a National School of Design graduate, and she's a writer in English and Tamil, and she works very closely with a young filmmaker, a very good young filmmaker called Amit Datta, whose wife she is. And she has a very deep link with and deep understanding of miniature paintings too, because she has also worked very closely with Professor B.N. Goswami. And the other speaker is Kumar Shahani. He's a great filmmaker, all-time great of India. And you know everything about him. If not, you can search it because it's everywhere. And Kumar is one of those great filmmakers of the world who created a kind of reflective space in cinema. And his films like Maya Darpan, like Tarang, like Kasba, like Char Adhyay, and these are all hallmarks. They are all milestones in the filmmaking world. And apart from that, Kumar is also a brilliant thinker. He has written a book, recently a book of his, Shock of Desire, was published. And it contains around 70 essays of Kumar. And these days, Kumar is making a film around Odissi dancer, Ileana Chetaresti. So they both have something to do with cinema and painting. And I am UDYAN VAJPEYI. I am a poet of no consequence. So the abstraction, the issue of abstraction that Kumar and Aishwarya are going to talk about, as a kind of introduction to that, there's a lot of confusion about this whole idea of abstraction. And I'm sure that Kumar and Aishwarya will throw some light on that confusion and will, in a sense, equip you to take care of that confusions. I think that the very idea of recreating, of creation, involves abstraction. There cannot be a creation without abstraction. You have to abstract in many sense from reality and from the non-reality, and only through that abstraction that you create. And the readers also receive it through the abstraction. For example, when you see a dance, so there is a movement in the dance, which means a material, and there is a meaning. And between the movement, material, and the meaning, there will always be a delay. There will always be a gap. You see, when the gesture is seen, and when its meaning or meanings open in your mind, there is a delay. And this delay always has a form. If you very carefully pay attention to what happens when you are actually seeing a work of art, you will always feel that you experience the time only through this delay. And this is purely abstract experience, because it's not the experience of the material. And it is exactly not the experience of the meaning also. It is somewhere in between that you experience something. And that forms the core of an artistic experience. And so the abstraction can be approached in many, many ways. And I'm sure that Kumar and Aishwarya would approach it very differently. Will show you and will tell you about lot new things that you might not have thought. Aishwarya has written a very brief paper that she would. Coincidentally, this is the first public discourse that Aishwarya would be giving. So So I'll request Aishwarya to read her paper, and if she feels like in between to speak without referring to the paper, she is welcome to do all that.
Thank you very much, Udyan. I owe great gratitude to Udyanji for placing so much confidence in me and giving this very special opportunity. Okay. And also it's a big privilege to talk with someone like Kumarji and himself. So I'll just briefly start reading. Abstraction in art is such a vast subject, and like the one standing in front of a big abstract painting, I first search for the point of entry. And just like my reaction to an abstract painting, I start from what is literally in front of me, the word abstract to begin with. It is such a paradoxical word. It simultaneously means an extraction or compression of form and connotes expansion and suggestion of ideas. A graph that showed how often the word was used in the English language between 1800 and 2008, it's a zigzag. It slowly peaks every 100 years and then rapidly declines, coming in and out of usage towards the last decades of every century. And now in the age of 3D cinema and virtual reality, the word is just declining from its peak. So too in art, abstraction seems to be rediscovered again and again, as cultures and civilizations mature and decay in every part of the world. But one common streak in the idea of abstraction all over the world is its relationship with the notion of the spiritual or existence of things beyond the realm of ordinary human reach. An extraordinary effort is demanded from the artist and the audience in turning the senses deep within oneself or concentrate the senses far outside of oneself to perceive a reality that is invisible and inaudible under ordinary circumstances. These visions are often expressed in extremely strict and condensed forms that do not imitate nature per se, but imitate her in her manner of operation, as Saint Aquinas had put it. And once this principle of abstraction reaches a certain peak in expression, it starts becoming a convention, and naturalism seeps into the art to make it more alive and immediate. And when naturalism becomes manneristic, it again starts becoming a convention, leading to Baroque ostentation. Then the cycle has to start all over again to go back to the basics, rediscover the wonder of the primeval and therefore the abstract. But the will to abstraction never quite dies in any society. It's like a secret underground river that resurfaces every time there is a crisis of faith. Because the human quest for meaning never dies. We need to constantly fight existential despair, and art and beauty never fail to give the intellect the solace that it never gets from religion or science. And abstraction in art gives the permission for human logic to take that leap into the unknown much more graciously than religion or science. Take, for example, the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. It is literally designed as a chapel containing massive triptychs of tones of black, painted by Mark Rothko. People of all faiths and no faith come here and experience a catharsis not unlike a religious one. They laugh, they cry, they meditate here, and they sing in the chapel. But the context for it is freely provided to them, much more than in a museum or an art gallery, because it is explicitly named as a chapel. So even the most abstract of art needs the right context to open up themselves to the willing audience, the Sahridaya in the Indian sense. It is not only the form of the artwork, but also the intention behind it, the artistic volition that precedes and defines the skill that finally realizes the abstract vision. So abstraction in art cannot be merely a style with which it is wont to be confused with. Especially since the advent of modernism, there is a tendency to search for abstraction in pure form. The critic Charles Bernstein says, "We speak of messy abstraction and clean abstraction, or sometimes biomorphic and geometric abstraction. But this applies not only for the work themselves, but also our approach to them. Abstraction is not only an idea or form, but also a matter of defamiliarization and derangement. Abstraction is in equal measures theatrical and performative, absorptive and ideal." This is what he says. So speaking merely at the formal level, what is abstraction for one person or culture is very faithful representation for another. In a Herzog documentary about the flying doctors of East Africa, a painted poster is shown to the local tribe to demonstrate how the tsetse fly is the cause of their eye infections. A huge realistically painted poster shows eye separately and fly separately, and the tribal people are asked to separate what is the eye and where is the fly. Nobody could identify. So a lot of what we take for granted as faithful reproduction of nature is naturally a conventionally learned sensibility like language or dress. One of the earliest known names for painting in Sanskrit language is Chitrabhas, where Chitra means likeness and Abhas is a distortion. By default, painting has to manipulate raw materials like paint and canvas to create a group of markings that resemble an external object. It is an abstraction no matter how illusionistic we can make it. It frustrated great Renaissance artists like Da Vinci, who actually wanted to become creators rather than suggesters. Da Vinci wanted to create 3D illusion and realized that no matter how well he could build up mass and depth on a canvas, he could never match the real depth of the scenery as perceived by two eyes. Before he could invent something like the stereoscope, he lost patience and just moved on to mathematics and to building flying machines, which he never did. That sums up the extraordinarily humanistic artistic volition of the entire Renaissance illusionism, the urge of man to become God. Yet the paradox of abstraction is that it can be housed in the most emphatic of representations. And similarly, even strictly formal artworks can be entirely devoid of abstraction. Mere formalization alone does not amount to abstraction, no matter how successful it is. Some of the greatest or most effective formalizations and symbols come from propaganda material. For example, the Russian communist pamphlets had starkly graphic images of towering, angular, glorified human figures, very similar to Nazi aesthetics. It pandered to the megalomaniac, self-aggrandizing, and aggressive tendencies of the human mind, rather than intellectual or spiritual empowerment. Even modern advertising and branding use such superficially aestheticized exaggerations to talk directly to biological instincts rather than the thinking apparatus of the human mind. Instead of creating the aesthetic distance between the audience and the subject matter, these insidious symbols are calculated to penetrate the mind directly, whether the viewer is willing to admit it in or not. Thus, forms can be used as containers for very specific ideas that can be injected into the viewer's mind directly. And this does not amount to empathy, and it is the opposite of abstraction, for it only reinforces biological habits, bypassing introspection or understanding. Abstraction, then, is that which breaks mental habits and opens up doorways of new ways of perceiving, understanding, and thinking. If you find Buddha on the road, kill him, says the Zen of Orison. That is a function of abstraction in art. That is, to free the mind of all idols and biases. At the same time, abstraction in conjunction with empathy also bridges and resolves the disputation between man and the outer world, the discord between instinct and understanding, in the words of the painter and theorist Willem Boeringer. That said, even in art, formal abstraction alone cannot achieve this resolution or liberation. Most of the painting styles, starting from Impressionism, followed by Cubism, Constructivism, etc., were more tilted towards the sense organs and sensuous perception, and the more playful of them, like Dada and Surrealism, created elaborate puns and metaphors, exploiting the way human minds make associations and memories. Very few painters like Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and later Mark Rothko took that formalism and playfulness ahead to a place that was beyond the phenomenal sensations of sight, sound, and also beyond semiotic webs of meaning. They aimed to suggest something beyond what was merely on the surfaces of the paint. Theirs was a worldview evolved from the meeting of the East and the West, from the Orientalized ideas of Enlightenment giants like Kant, Goethe, and Baudelaire. So abstract art does not pull the viewer in eagerly like commercial art. It waits patiently with open doors. The viewer has to work equally hard to discover the discrete windows and doors that can lead them into that special aesthetic world. the reward for which is pure aesthetic rapture, the state of chamatkrita, which literally means eternal tasting. It's a profoundly sensuous and yet hermeneutical satisfaction of the spirit. That does not mean that abstract art should be without beauty or charm, but it's a difficult and even unsettling beauty, and it is identified by the place where its creator has placed the greatest beauty, whether in the body of the artwork, in its mind, or even further back into its spirit. So this brings us back to the spiritual in art, a concept disputed and elucidated not only in contemporary art and philosophy, but also well over the ages from ancient times onwards, and most vehemently in the Indian tradition. One may recall that controversial aesthetic marker of Indian aesthetics called dhvani, which was first, probably last exemplified in the works of Abhinavgupta in the 10th century. Just like the presence of the spiritual, the presence of dhvani has remained the greatest abstraction of Indian aesthetics, probably after Shunya. And very often, rival theorists have questioned the very existence of such a thing. The problem with dhvani, as with all theories of abstraction, has remained that it makes sense only within the holistic framework of the way the universe makes sense through the limitations of human perception. It involves metaphysics and cosmology, with which not everybody is comfortable with. So let me try to summarize as briefly as possible. The soul of poetry, according to aesthetician Anand Vardhan, was not rasa, which in itself is an abstraction of an emotion, but according to him, the soul of poetry was vyanjana, which is the process of revelation of the full import of the poetry on the listener's mind, which is visualized as a mirror. So it is not merely connotation, denotation, or even metaphor. It is the revelation of a bigger picture, a wholeness of meaning that is experienced after mentally registering all the connections. But this revelation is possible only through the carrier of that revelatory information, which he calls dhvani. Dhvani for him was both the physical sound in the form of phonemes, distributed in time, that carried the poetic message, and also the effect of its persistence in time. Udyanji also talked about the delay. So during the delay, this dhvani is reflecting the image of the poetry completely onto the viewer's mind, and that is how it is made full again in the mind of the sahridaya, or the audience. So in other words, dhvani is the resonance that comprises the full gestalt of the word meaning association that is reflected in the mind of the listener. Just as even mountains can be reflected in a small mirror or gem, vast concepts can be conveyed through sounds that couch words projected into the audience perception, which is like a mirror. So dhvani becomes the light that reveals the word for the audience. The revelation or vyanjana is possible only after the last phoneme is uttered. And even after the last dhvani is uttered, it is a creative intuition, the pratibha, that fits together the fragments of sounds, words, and sentences and recreates the wholeness of meaning that precedes its fragmentation in time. The equivalent word for pratibha in English would be genius, which etymologically. Abhinavgupta expanded this concept with his cosmological vision. In his tradition, the universe is a vibratory organism that comprises of the subtlest substance at its apex, and in its playful exuberance and independence, the subtle matter slowly descends down into grosser and grosser elements like will, knowledge, and action, and further down into space, time, and other limitations, and even further down into mind, intellect, ego, and then into the sense perceptions and their objects, and to the grossest 5 elements, the last of which is earth. But in reality, the manifestations are only inverse mirror images of the unmanifest subtle principles behind them, like a concave mirror. So, the grossest element is in direct correlation with the subtlest, and every object contains the whole macrocosm within itself. Accordingly, dhvani, the very clay from which words are modeled, contains within it the entire macrocosm of the essence of words. The theory of the word or vak is also about the descent of the word from its subtlest to its grossest. Word is classified as para, apara, pashyanti, madhyami, vaikari, and finally vak itself. Para is a transcendent word that is beyond perception. Apara is its descent into an episteme, meaning you can say. Pashyanti falls further down into the realm of semantics. Madhyami has reached the mind. Vaikari is a fully formed interior word, and vak is what is finally enunciated and reaches the listener. So, dhvani is that independent vibratory principle of the word that travels not only downwards from the undifferentiated wholeness to the fragmented vaikari, but it can also travel upward and become the channel of transcendence for the listener into a realm beyond sense perception. Ananda opined that every little textual element should add to the critic's judgment, including nominal endings, verbal endings, connectives, conjunctions. It's a big list. So what Ananda gets out of Abhinava, how he summarizes it is that the soul of poetry is the excess that is obtained from all the sum of all the constituents of poetry. The excess that suggests more than what is manifest in its body alone. In other words, what is contained by the body. Since poiesis is the basis of all aesthetic experience, what if we transpose this with painting from another tradition? Let's take, for instance, the celebrated late style of masters of the Western illusionistic tradition, like Titian and Rembrandt. After mastering the conventions of their medium, they both suddenly abandoned the sheen and finish of their early works, and their paintings, when seen in close-up, became a chaos of brush strokes, bold impastures, and seemingly effortless gestures of great energy and intuition. These almost disturbingly reminded the viewer of the very raw materials of the pigments, bristles of the brushes and canvas. But when seen from a distance, all these disparate constituents miraculously coalesce into a wholeness that not only reveals the scenery in full depth and volume, but suddenly throws open the whole game of artistic creation for us. One brushstroke then transports us breathlessly into the landscape of the painting, the painter's mind, his skill, and a deep aesthetic satisfaction that comes from the resolution of instinct and intellect, as Warringer had stated before. The painting becomes more than a sum of its constituents. That excess is the realm of abstraction, the function of varna, which interestingly is another name for dhvani as used by Bhartrhari. The farther the manifested form could be pushed in its conveyance of the unmanifest, the more abstract it becomes. Its surfaces become increasingly translucent, and for that matter, the surfaces become increasingly indispensable in enabling that aesthetic transport. For the same reason that the sense organs are considered the windows of the soul, the sensuous surface of the artwork becomes the window to the infinite, the unknown. We can recall Kandinsky's translation of music into color and form. It was farther down the lane of synesthetic abstraction than anybody had dared to go before him. But he could create that resonance in his viewers. He could make them listen to the shrillness of his yellows and the somberness of his deep blues. He made visible the rhythms and melodies that are inaudible. The story of poetic vision and inspiration is also a story of descent from the unmanifest to the manifest, from Nirgun to Shagun. At every level of descent from the primordial wholeness, a mutilation and fragmentation is inevitable. The pioneering artist is no less than Prometheus, who had stolen the fire from the gods and was brutally punished for it. But the urge to create is unstoppable and inexplicable. So too the urge in the viewer towards abstraction, racing towards a primordial wholeness through the channel of the sense organs, is ever persistent. As long as Mona Lisa's smile remains undeciphered, only so long shall it remain the greatest painting on earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwarya. Before we come to Kumar, I was reminded of three things. One is that the poem. In a poem, for example, you write a sentence, a vakya, so that you can give space to something which is a vakya, which is unsayable. So you do sayables and create a space for unsayable because it is unsayable. So in a sense, the unmanifest in your. And secondly, in the Raza theory, in Abhinavgupta's commentary, become, which is called Rasaswaran, you actually become a parinit pramatrit. That means you become the Sahriday becomes infinite witness. So now you become, when you become the whole of the reality, then obviously you look beyond it. And so that experience is of a different kind then. And now I'll request Kumar to address.
Well, I am a little embarrassed being in the center here, but these two inconsequential poets that are sitting around, always put me in that kind of position. And he's the chairperson today, so I requested him to please take the chair. But instead, he went to my left, which is unusual for him. He can't, I thought, ever go to my left. So, being a leftist, a kind of, propagandist and so on myself. And then there is this beautiful woman who I am constrained to put on my right, because just before we came in, I adopted her as my daughter. She looks very much like her. So forgive this position in which I am. And the other thing which is disturbing me very much is that the sound of the air conditioner or some system here interfered with her presentation, so that some of the dhwani was lost, and it's of utmost importance that it was lost. And so please do not judge her only by what she said, the objective thing, the thing that she referred to, her references. But try, like when you hear a bad recording from very old times, say of Rahmat Khan Sahib or something, it's done on wire, and he goes, and you say, what the hell? All these great musicians of India, from the Drupadiyas to the latest anti-Khayaliya, would say that, he's above all gharanas and everything. So, through all this air conditioning, system noises, etc., try and imagine what her enunciation might have really sounded like. And it would have naturally provided precisely that resonance which we cannot name, which defies naming or numeralizing, which are the two difficult kind of irritants almost, although they are the most important carriers of truth, that is the akshara and the ank. But they are also the carriers of what would I say, ignorance, as they are of truth. That's It's a very big problem. And we have to somehow overcome that very search, that struggle to know, and which is being frustrated. We have to overcome that frustration. And then we would be able to get to perhaps that unmanifest non-thing, probably the shunya, which a bodhisattva like Gyatru that she's mentioned in the Journey to the West. The meaning of that is emptiness reached. So only that, the meaning of her name itself is emptiness reached. Maybe if we pay enough attention to it, will we get to know something non-thing of it. And just a few days ago, a Bangalorean presented something in London at the ongoing London Indian Film Festival. This is in a report that I read 3 days ago, I think. And these are films which are made not on film, not on celluloid, not also on not in a camera, not with a camera, one camera or two cameras or three cameras, but several cameras all together.
Kumar,
yes?
straight, don't look towards them, because then the
Yeah.
voice gets lost.
Okay, sorry. So this Bangalorean person, young man, has made virtual reality films which give you a 360-degree immersive experience. I'm quoting this from the report. Obviously, this is an experience that is greatly intensive, more than any other technologically invented environmental attempts at art, So it is something which goes beyond 3D, beyond IMAX. And one of these films has the title with a question mark at the end. And that title is Shower With Me. So it is an invitation to share a sensuous experience. Now, however, Sagiraju, the filmmaker, is quoted in the Hindu of the 29th June 2017 as saying, the response to the film was exceptional. Many viewers were heard screaming with a strong urge to take off their headsets, unable to complete the viewing of the film. So, I was delighted by this report. In fact, before this report came, I had phoned a couple of friends of mine and asked them whether they could find something or create something for me which would give us all, this present lot of us, a sort of, a wake-up kind of signal, a signal. And that signal should be like lightning, something of that kind. And indeed, they said, yes, we will try, but it never happened. I had asked other people before as well, whether they could create that signal. I was sometimes visiting visiting artists in several institutes of advanced studies and so on, where I would ask them, can you do it for me? And they would say yes, but they wouldn't be able to do it. But obviously, this person from Bangalore has been able to do something of that sort, and to create that kind of virtual reality where these people wanted to take off their headsets and run from that place. So, and further, the filmmaker goes on to say that he confesses that there is yet no grammar for the new technological experience. That means it says nothing. It's just a sensation. It reminds me also when Jean-Marie Stroop saw a film of mine in Rotterdam. He said, I liked it because it was very warm. And I was very surprised because everyone in India at that time had told me it was the coldest and most boring film that they had ever seen, which was called Maya Darpan. And so I said, so how did you find it warm? Because everyone else even used to seek me out at bigger congregations than this one. They would come up to me and say, I'm so happy to meet you at last after so many years. This was even right up to 1980s, mid-1980s. They would come up and say, I've been wanting to tell you, this is the most horrible film I've ever seen. Just Maya Darpan. So anyway, and Jean-Marie Stroop had just come out of Maya Darpan. So he said it's very warm because here you can feel something. It is not just a sensate. It's not just a sensate thing. You don't only feel the sensation, but you do feel the sensation, but you go somewhere else with it. That's how it is warm. Otherwise, the pure sensation is cold for him. So it was going in the opposite direction to that. So I feel that you could not, Sagiraju, the filmmaker, has understood that a sensation which just hits you in that way cannot be savored. Like wine, it cannot be savored. When you sip a glass of wine, you not only feel the sensation of the wine in your mouth, but you are able to swallow it both mentally and physically. And that's how wine, for example, has become part of rituals. It gives you again that it's before wine, I guess there were other drinks like the soma, etc. But at the moment, wine is one of those kind of things that you can really savor. I think that he would agree to my choice of the word savoring, since he is aware that the aesthetic experience in India, as she has already so clearly shown us, is very deeply connected to the joy of knowledge, the simple joy of knowledge. My colleague from France, my elder colleague, called Jean-Luc Godard had also made a film called Le Gai Savoir. Le Gai Savoir literally means, joyous knowledge. And that joy of knowledge is in itself a mode of self-realization. Just knowing through that, it is itself, in itself, self-realization. We are all committed through our culture to the savoring of the rasa, with all the multivalence of that, not the object. As the Upanishads speak of it, it's not the object. So we don't imitate anything. We don't present an object that which surrounds us, envelops us in fetus folds, several folds around, that gives rise to infinite dimensionalities. Normally, things that we have in front of us have length, breadth, etc., and we run out of words for the dimensionalities very quickly, 4 or 5 dimensions. I mean, Einstein even had to stop at 4 dimensions, but now already people are speaking of n dimensions. Anyway, I was very happy to see that this person then accepts, having used, I think, infinite dimensionalities, accepts that actually it does not help in the Bharat. The Bharat will come only through some elaboration, will come rather through that constant growth within the folds of the fetus, like the Sangeet Ratnakar, in fact, does have its own preface in that. And then, was it not Shiva Nataraj himself that revealed to Panini the rules of the game? So there is that also, that the intervals, because grammar, like any other structure, is concerned with intervals. How do you place a thing or place a name or an object, or so that disappears and the intervals remain. How could I have known this rapture would make me so crazy? Turn my heart into a hell and my eyes into rivers. How could I have known a tidal wave would suddenly snatch me and toss me like a ship in a sea of blood? A wave strikes the ship and splits the planks one by one. Each plank whirls away separately. Just then a whale appears and drinks up the ocean. The endless sea becomes dry as a desert. The next moment the sand sparks, the desert swallows the sea drinker. All at once the hand of wrath drags it into the depths. When all this ocean, sea and desert are no more, when existence draws in its opposite, how could I have known what it is like? I keep saying, how could I have known? But I don't know. This is another inconsequential poet called Rumi from Persia in the 13th century, of course. I'm sorry, I did try to learn this poem, but, and in fact I was going to also bring it on a recording, on 3 recordings actually. One recited by a Persian woman, another by a Persian man, and the third by a friend of mine from Pune, who plays the Pakhavaj and who then read this poem to Amol, some of them know him. He tried to give it the intervals of a Pakhavaj Paran. You know, he transformed it into a new kind of Paran based on his knowledge of the playing of the Pakhavaj. So imagine yourself in the boat with the planks reaching out to the sky in curvatures. That is, you are in the boat, not from outside. You know. So you go into the boat, and these are in curvatures hitherto unknown for woods and arms and wings. You know. So imagine this whole dance is created in front of you. These boats, by the way, these kind of boats are still made in Kerala, somewhere near Calicut. The boat that Rumi is referring to. They are completely handmade. And those planks are like that. So, you know, when they are handmade, there's obviously a very different curvature. And each parabola has a kind of leaf-like, like something, or the branch-like thing over there. If you see it in its you know, if you see it closely. Of course, there's another problem here, which is that the light is hitting you. The light source is on the other side of that thing. But if you, this photograph is by somebody called Sanchita Bhattacharya, who's just sent it from Calcutta to my partner, Rimli Bhattacharya. And if you can see it more closely later, perhaps, but in the meantime, you can imagine it, there's no problem. That you will see the several intervals, so to say, that are created within it, and yet forms coming to sometimes as the shadows of natural forms, sometimes architectural design forms. Anyway, so if you imagine yourself in that boat with a plank, I believe in individuation to the extent that every time I meet a new person, like I met her today, and I adopted her as one of my daughters, and I think there is a possibility of discovering that individuation, you know, which is, if you're a believer, God-given, which if you're a non-believer, which I am a communist as well, that it gives you tremendous freedom and reiterates the desire to live. And now, if you see that therefore each curvature is an ellipse of a sort. It is an ellipse which never tells you that this is a circle, this is a triangle, and this is a, you know, square, and so on. Then you say, yes, it is like something like that, but it is not so. And I live with 3 drawings by Nasreen Mohammadi. Nasreen was a very close friend of mine, and I have these drawings. Udyan has seen them, I think. Ashok has seen them. And other people who come to my home too. It is a triptych that I have of hers, and it was invited a couple of years ago to be shown in retrospectives in Spain and at the Metropolitan in New York. And I said that after consulting a few artist friends and so on, I didn't know how to part with those drawings. And you know, some people had come and photographed them, etc. And then some other people, a very nice person called Suman, who I think runs an art gallery, had come with somebody from Ireland to see it. And they both asked whether Nasreen had used any instruments in doing that work. So I said, I think she might have, but she had also used her hands. So they are that kind of thing, mysterious. So I wrote back to the curators. Nasreen and her work are very, very dear to me, and they are as vulnerable to violation as India has been over these centuries. And I think I was being very true.
Yes.
It is still being violated. So let me please tell you that I want her to be celebrated. Like I want India and Nasreen to be celebrated. I want her work to be known as a prayer for all humanity, even though I have no God to pray to. But I want her work to be known as a prayer. In and for themselves, these last works of hers, they were the last works of hers, were the closest to that call to Khuda or Allah or whatever you want to say, that cri de coeur, as in French, you know, which means the cry from the heart, which governs the enunciation. And that is what I had told her, Nasreen. She was in a very bad state, with a neurological condition, which probably he can enlighten us what it was. But I don't know the name for it. But she was hardly able to walk or even speak at that time. But I saw the paintings, not the paintings, the drawings with her. And I said exactly the same thing to her, which I wrote to the curators later, much later. So I talked to her. She walked with me to the taxi outside. I mean, I had to catch a taxi back home, just outside Jahangir Art Gallery. But she came in from inside, and she almost dragged her feet on it, and in spite of her terrible condition. I begged and begged of her not to come out on the street because she was wincing with pain. But she insisted with her utmost discretion. Anybody who had met Nasreen even once would know that she was one of the most discreet, very aristocratic persons. One of the most famous scientists of our country, was a most well-known person as well, was the bird watcher, you know. So, and her whole family. I shot Tarang, my second feature film, in in the house which was inhabited by part of her family, and who used, I think one of her sisters was teaching at Elphinstone College. So, of those times, not the completely lumpenized place it is now. Now, Wahida Rahman also used to live just below there. You know. So she was like in pain, but so discreet and so compassionate. She then opened the taxi door and put me in a cab. And of course, later I had taken those. I told her that I wanted those paintings, those works. The minimality of her work is meaningful in ways that have yet to be unraveled. It is now that she is being discovered in these last 10 years or so. 5 years, I don't know. Yet the very religions that brought these particular significations to light are destroying those very signs through the power that they wield in political economies of terror and mental manipulation. It is through that aspect. Creating moon landscapes by serial bombing and mines that one might step on and set off anywhere. Somebody in a train who had served with the Indian Army told me that he was in Afghanistan, and he said that anywhere you walk in Afghanistan, you can set off a mine with your footstep. This was years ago already. I don't know what the condition is like now. It must be worse, if anything. When Nasreen wiped a speck of anything from the surface, and this actually happened, what I'm telling you. When I first went to her place in Baroda, when Nasreen wiped a speck of anything from the surface immediately in front of her, it was actually a drop of tea on the floor on which we were sitting. Her anguish evoked the stretches of sand in which every grain has the promise of life yet to manifest itself. But she was erasing it because it has too much life in it, that speck, that little drop. So, Mr. Chairman will probably tell me how to recite this. Nuktachi hai game dil, usko sunaya na bane. Okay. Kya bane baat, jahan baat banaye na bane. The acoustics that grew out of the Perso-Indian architecture developed from the tent gave us the poetry of the northwestern root of cannabis and silk. Cannabis and silk was canvas which was used for the tents and for the opium as well, was on this route, and still the PPP sometimes is called the Pakistan People's Party, is called the Pakistan's Poppy Party. And silk through central India, it went right up to Bijapur, whence it spread in all directions. That acoustics, not just the tent. I believe Delhi is one of the greatest centers for tent making of that sort, even today in the world. Whence it spread in all directions, preceding not only the whispering gallery of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, but also the musical and metrical forms that appeared organically where Zoroaster's flame first burned. let me say, all in Central Asia, where Mahavir and Gautam cautioned us about our egos. This is again the next layer in Central Asia. And you know, domes are made also of these kind of layers, leading us to infinite compassion to share the word, to share it actually. That's how the mahfil of shires and singers and our interruptions in it, like, you know, Wawa, etc., take place. So imagine layers, and okay, new meanings came through residual syllables in the Shabad and the Khayal, from which, you know, the like the tans of Drupad, you know, were changed, or the gamakas of Drupad were changed, multiplied into what we have now in the Shabad and the Khayal, in the recitation. And because it was traveling like that, all over, you know, like my Ustad used to tell me that the Murki and the Khatka are not allowed in Drupad, you know. However, Pandit Ravi Shankar used to play both of them, and say that he was a Drupadiya. You know. So imagine layers of thick cloths, knitted, crocheted, woven, and perhaps also embroidered, with their interstices overlapping to make together, as it were, a shell-like vault of heaven, from which both light and sound and perhaps breath itself shimmers, releases tints, overtones, hints of lost perfumes in the tumescence of ecstasy. Imagine the consciousness it engenders in the nervous system that makes us so vibe with this awesome universe that we are both thrilled and overwhelmed by our own naked insight, levitating us even as we obtain the primeval gift of knowing. Like the vectors of a mihrab, finding themselves reflected in the dua of Adarang, rendered in the majesty of a darbar. Here, the Andolit Swara is both in ascent and descent. It is Andolit, evoking all the stations or maqams, asserting the peripeties, the wanderings in the descent, glimpsing the jhankis of notes. You know, each one is divine in the meenkari of the Uttarang. This is how, for instance, Adarang's Karima Namateru is sung. And of course, this brings us to the last line of that poem, Ishq par zor nahi hai ye wo aatish, jo lagaye na lage aur bujaye na bane. It is like being within the lotus, not objectifying it, not making a poster out of it, and seeing it realize itself, where its petals are the leaping flames of Agni, spasms of birth and death of every moment, of every meter, and beyond, in the incompletion, not the completion, in the incompletion of forms, the melodies of vowels, the involuntary openings of orifices. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Kumar. Thanks a lot. It really evoked a lot of thoughts in all of us. We must have. If somebody wants to talk to, ask questions, or engage into some kind of conversation with both of them or any one of them, you are free to do it.
In your work, how was it in realism both of you have.
You too. Yeah. You speak. Yeah.
No, I've only written screenplays, so I've seen the transformation of it in my husband's work. He is a filmmaker for whom I write. Pardon? So when I've realized, so I'll talk about that transformation. When I write, it's completely narrative. I have a story in mind, I do the research and all that. And the magic of it and the suspense of it is to see it completely taken apart and put together the way he does. So, and it is not based on meaning, it is based on rhythm. And most of the work he does on the editing table. So, meter, chand, enunciation, whatever, that is what finally, I think, brings out the magic of probably.
Kumar was once telling me about one of his films being seen by Bresson, with whom he has worked, and Bresson was actually giving rhythm while he was seeing Mayadar, if I'm
That's
not
right.
wrong. And suddenly he told Kumar, you know, they have cut a portion, part, which means that it got out of joint. And he immediately realizes, so when you are seeing a film, you are not only seeing that, actually you are also seeing and experiencing that rhythm, which in a sense is a very abstract thing, and that makes you experience something much beyond what you are seeing or what you are listening to.
Udyan has actually, we have worked together, so maybe he can speak about it in a better way than I can. And he's a poet so as well, so I can't possibly compete with him in speech.
Like for example, his film, Khayal Gatha. So the way, I mean, what he says about the junctions, the way you move from one sound to the other, from one image to the other, that is something in a great cinema. That's really that's a locus of your experience that takes you, and that is what you're calling the abstract. But in fact, what you're calling realism, you see, realism is actualization of an available idea, and abstraction is a search for the truth, if you may, I mean, or a thought, or what she or he said, the experience of that knowledge. So when you start with a certain idea, I mean, Kumar go on saying, calling himself a communist, but he's a very paradoxical communist, that you know, you don't start with idea. You seek truth there. And what happens is that what is called realism actually is an actualization of an idea. And that's the realism, you know, that, and all wonderful works of art have actually broken it, have questioned that. You start with what Abhinav Gupta says, that, you know, you fill up a poet or a filmmaker or a painter, gets filled up with a certain bhav, and he or she starts working, and what gets realized is a work of art. He or she will not start with an idea. In fact, it's a very interesting thing that happened in the 19th century. There was this very great novelist called Flaubert, the French, right pronunciation of French, Kumar will tell. Flaubert, at the end of his last novel, made a list which is called the Dictionary of Received Ideas. So, you know, every author, every artist has this dictionary of received ideas, in which is there that it should not come in a work of art, because it should not precede, the idea or knowledge doesn't precede a work of art. It aspires for that. But in realism, you start with something which you already know. And I think that's, so therefore, a filmmaker can be abstract even if he's showing the figures. I mean, it's completely, because that figure is not placed properly in a certain well-defined idea. Because it can evoke, like he's talked about the Rumi. It is elliptical. It ellipses. It can take you. Its dhwani can take you elsewhere, which it does. I mean, so therefore, it is abstract in all. And abstract, like everything, like Sudha's poetry is also abstract, being sung by so many people. Abstract is not something which Indians, at least, particularly, or Asians, are. All of our traditions are like that. The danger is to literalize the tradition, I would think. And when you literalize the tradition, you stop the search for truth. Then you start by available truths, and you want to realize them in forms. And that is exactly what Aishwarya referred to as propaganda. If anybody else wants to say something, please do. Yeah.
मेरा सवाल तो नहीं है, मैं समझने की कोशिश कर रहा हूँ आपका दोनों का व्याख्यान सुनने के बाद कि अमूर्त जो भी ये शब्द आलोचकों के दिए हुए शब्द होंगे, जो देखने जाता है पेंटिंग, सिनेमा, कविता, तो ये शब्दावली उसके पास तो नहीं होती है, तो आलोचक जो है अमूर्त भी है। पर ठीक है, अमूर्त जो है अंततः तो वो कहीं न कहीं कोई चीज मूर्त करने की ही कोशिश है। दो रास्ते अलग अलग हैं, एक बिल्कुल सीधा है, कोई चीज मूर्त है, और एक फॉर्म जो है वो अमूर्त रूप में है। लेकिन अमूर्त जब गेंदे का कोई पेंट कर रहा है, या अर्पिता सिंह की आप पेंटिंग देखें जो वायलेंस के खिलाफ, वो अब उनको आप कहेंगे जो कि मूर्त है, वो इलस्ट्रेशन नहीं है। वो पेंटिंग्स मेरे हिसाब से मैं उनको अमूर्त की श्रेणी में रखता हूँ, क्योंकि वो चीजों को जैसे गेंदे का तोड़ रही है, अपने वक्त को भी, चीजों को भी। अर्पिता जी की काफी पेंटिंग जो वायलेंस के खिलाफ में तोड़ रही है, वो अमूर्त की श्रेणी में रखी जानी चाहिए। लेकिन अंततः एक मूर्त रूप में आप चीजों को वो ले जा रहे हैं। तो ये जो मूर्त और अमूर्त का रिश्ता है, जो बहुत दूरी जब खींचने की कोशिश होती है, तो मेरा मानना है कि वो निरर्थक है। आप इस बारे में क्या सोचते हैं? एक छोटी सी कविता अगेर की है कि मैं सच लिखता हूँ, लिख लिख कर सब झूठा करता जाता हूँ। यानी जब तक लिखता हूँ तब तक सच है, लेकिन वो सच कितना कम्युनिकेट हुआ है पता नहीं, क्योंकि लगभग वो नामुमकिन चीज है आर्ट में। इसलिए आपके सामने अमूर्त है, वो कितना मूर्त हुआ, जितना जो सफल हो गया, वो बड़ा कलाकार हो गया, लेकिन फिर भी उनको लगता है कि ठीक ठीक वो तो मूर्त नहीं हो पाया, जिसको मैंने अमूर्त के रूप में विजुलाइज किया और सोचा कि ये चीज जो है मैं पहुंचा पाऊंगा। इसलिए मैं सच लिखता हूँ, लिख लिख कर सब झूठा करता जाए, जो पहुंचता है पता नहीं कितना सच है।
Abstract quality आ गई। Abstract quality।
तो ये जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट है मूर्त और अमूर्त का, तो इस पे कुछ आप अगर और साफ कर पाए।
Say something.
I just, uski opposite, I'm getting some, I'm remembering some stories that you were saying how the abstract is made, even what we are thinking is abstract is a manifestation of something. At the same time, what we are thinking is real is also abstract. And the story was about an old Chinese painter, Chen Yun, whose master told him that, there is some lack of realism in your painting. Why don't you practice by putting a silk screen in front of a rugged wall and keep staring at it, and then landscapes will start emerging, and then you just trace them out, and then it becomes more real. You'll feel, and many Renaissance painters have also used that technique.
Yes,
So
yes. That is so.
it is a paradox.
It arrives, and it arrives on its own, as it were. Therefore, one of the main concerns for any artist at any time is that not only to free yourself from that object, but to free yourself from every instrumentality that, like he said, he is of no consequence. Thank God he is of no consequence. if he were of any consequence, he would not be a poet. You know? And moreover, he would, in fact, also have such a sort of, in the case of Agay, he said it in his own way, but like some artists and poets I have known from different languages and in different stylistics, they say very sadly that they have post-coital depression. You know, it's after they it's nothing. You know, that means they have not only lost their spiritual, but their sensual being in the act. You know, which is actually otherwise something giving them jouissance, you know, giving them the greatest amount of pleasure. After all, for a poet, the greatest pleasure is to write, and so on. And you know, this seeking of freedom is, I think, something which everybody wants to move towards. This. Her husband, for instance, is constantly seeking freedom for color as significatory. You know, the little work that I have seen of his, I haven't seen all of his work. But if somebody tries to tell him, for example, to her husband, that you use that color to say something, or use it for X, Y, Z message or whatever, you know, or to depict something, he will just collapse. You know, he can't do it. He'll collapse. He wants to work in such a way that freedom comes on its, and it should arrive more or less. It is not something like, that's why, like when Picasso was actually searching, he says, I do not search, I find. You know, that's what he means. That it happens on its own, you know. To Bresson, for example, it is a flash, that the whole appears in a flash, you know, when he makes a film. And obviously in a flash, you don't literally have the whole thing. You know, later on, I shot with, you know, I was at his shooting, I could see that every shot was a big struggle, but he took the same thing, like, say, we are having a conversation, and you have nodded, and while you're nodding, he will make you, suppose he wants to take this scene between us, and just this much, I'll say, Om, what do you think? And you nod, this much. And he will take this, my saying it 40 times, and he'll take your nod 40 times, and then he will put it together. Because he has to find, you know, of course I can never afford to do such a thing. I can't even take 2 takes. But that was his method of finding.
I can mail it to you.
They will publish.
जी हाँ जरूर
एक कुमार जी छोटा सा सवाल और सिनेमा के बाद मैं सोचता था ज्यादा होगी आपने गोदार के उसको हवाले दिए पर फीचर फिल्म में एक्टेड की पॉसिबिलिटी कम है और कम्युनिकेट तो करना है, कम्युनिकेट डॉक्यूमेंट्री में भी करना है, पर डॉक्यूमेंट्री में एक जो स्टोरी लाइन है वो उस ढंग से नहीं है जो फीचर फिल्म में आपको चाहिए। हालांकि आजकल ऐसी फिल्म्स के भी एक्सपेरिमेंट हुए हैं जो बंदे बंदाए नॉवल को लेके, कहानी को लेकर के नहीं चल रही है, जिसमें हीरो है, हीरोइन है और तमाम चीजें उस तरह की स्क्रीन प्ले को तोड़ा भी है कई फिल्मों में। लेकिन डॉक्यूमेंट्रीज जो हैं वो ज्यादा स्कोप छोड़ती हैं आपके लिए, वरना आपको फीचर फिल्म में तो जो है वो मूर्त रहना ही पड़ता है।
No, I do not believe that there is a kind of dichotomy between narration and abstraction. This debate started somewhere, I think, around the 50s. Precisely because of a certain tendency which she mentioned in Soviet art, that which was dictated by Stalinist and Zarnovist type of treatment of narrative. Actually, narratives are of many, many kinds. And in Khayal Gatha, since you mentioned it, I might as well say that there are at least 4 or 5 different kinds of narratives. And I discovered them as a result of studying music, And now, my teacher, other from Bresson in filmmaking, was Ritik Ghatak, and he had pointed out how one could move towards. He has made a film called Titash Ekti Nodi Naam, which is absolutely fantastic, and within it you can see several narratives. And if you read the Mahabharata, which I have had the opportunity to read along with a Pune Brahmin, Good Bole Chitpavan with grey eyes, and he showed me how the different narratives proceeded, And when you put one layer of narrative on another, you already have music. You just have to put two things together, and even in a picture, Now, if you see the underlying, even of one picture, the underlying grid, or say 2 or 3 grids, on which these lines can be made, of the branch, of the artificial, that means architectural rooftops or something, or the tower, and the narrative. After all, narrative is a sequence. It is a temporal space, with several other dimensions within, So I have always tried to say that for me, narrative as well as abstraction are not only capable of being together, but in fact, in the epic form, they are together. That is what constitutes the epic form.
Thank you very much, Aishwarya. Thank you very much, Kumar, for this very enlightening talk. The next art dialogue, which is 5th in the sequence, will take place on 6th of August next month. It will be figures in and of